Right now, inside your head is the most complex object we know of in the entire universe. It's this spongy 3-pound mass of tissue that lets us do everything from composing music to exploring space to even wondering about itself. So, how does this incredible machine actually work? Well, let's find out. This one organ is the absolute command center for everything you do, from your breathing and heartbeat to your biggest hopes and dreams. It is literally what makes you, you. And trying to figure out how it all works, well, that's one of the biggest scientific puzzles we've ever tried to solve. So why is it such a huge challenge? Well, for starters, just look at this number. Neuroscientists have to make sense of a machine that's built from as many as 1 trillion individual nerve cells. That's a million components. The scale is just mind-boggling. And the stakes here are unbelievably high. When the brain doesn't work the way it's supposed to, the cost is staggering. We're talking over $400 billion a year in the US for more than 1,000 different disorders. And get this, brain disorders lead to more hospitalizations than both heart disease and cancer combined. So understanding this organ isn't just a curiosity, it's an absolutely critical mission. Okay, so to even begin to understand the brain, we have to start small. We have to look at its messenger, the fundamental building block of this entire system, the neuron. Everything the brain does, every thought, every feeling, comes down to this one incredible type of cell. The neuron is the basic working unit, a specialized little messenger designed to do one thing: transmit information. You can think of it like a tiny biological wire, passing signals to other nerve cells or muscles or glands. So how does it do that? Let's break it down. A neuron has 3 main parts. First, you've got the cell body, that's where the nucleus is. Then you have all these branch-like things called dendrites, which comes from the Greek word for tree, and you can see why. Their job is to receive messages. And finally, you have this long fiber, the axon, which sends the message on its way. Okay, so these neurons communicate at these little contact points called synapses. The word itself comes from the Greek for to clasp together. But here's the really wild part. They don't actually touch. There's this tiny, microscopic gap between them, and that tiny little space is where all the magic happens. The whole process is like a perfectly choreographed little dance. First, an electrical signal arrives, zipping down the axon. When it gets to the very end, bam! It triggers the release of these little chemical messengers. And finally, those chemicals float across the gap and bind to the next neuron, kind of like a key fitting perfectly into a lock. And just like that, the message is received. So we have the individual messengers, but how do they all connect to form a living, breathing supercomputer? Let's take a look at how the brain actually gets wired up. It's really an amazing journey. I mean, at just 3 weeks after conception, it all begins as this simple, hollow tube. By 4 weeks, you can already see the basic brain regions starting to take shape. Fast forward all the way to 9 months, and that simple little tube has become this incredibly complex network of billions of neurons, all ready for a lifetime of learning. But here's where it gets really cool. The developing brain actually overproduces connections. It creates this messy, inefficient tangle. Then it starts a process of pruning. Think of it like a gardener trimming a bush. The connections that are active and get used a lot survive and get even stronger. But the ones that are quiet and don't see much action, they get lost. It is the ultimate use it or lose it principle, and it creates a much faster, more efficient network. Okay, so we've got this elegantly wired brain. Let's see it in action with something you're doing right this very second. Seeing. How in the world does your brain turn simple light into the world you perceive all around you? It all starts the moment light hits the retina at the very back of your eye. Now, the retina is just jam-packed with about 125 million of these little photoreceptor cells. You've got rods for seeing in dim light and cones for bright light and color. Their only job is to turn that incoming light into an electrical signal that the brain can actually understand. From the eye, those electrical signals travel down the optic nerve all the way to the very back of your brain, landing in what's called the occipital lobe. This area is the brain's primary visual cortex. It's where the real work of turning those raw signals into what we actually call sight begins. And here is a super weird but totally cool quirk of the brain's wiring. Everything you see in your left field of vision is actually processed by the right side of your brain, and everything on your right is handled by the left side. Your brain does this crossover constantly, stitching it all together so seamlessly that you never ever notice it's happening. So your brain takes in the world through vision and your other senses. But how does it hold on to those experiences? How does it build the architecture of memory that makes you who you are? So, this leads to the big question, right? Where does the brain actually store all this information? Is there some kind of central hard drive tucked away in our heads where all our memories live? For a long time, this was a huge mystery, but a major breakthrough came from a patient known in medical history as HM. To relieve his severe epilepsy, surgeons removed part of his medial temporal lobe. Afterwards, he could remember his childhood perfectly, but he was almost completely unable to form new long-term memories. This tragic case gave scientists a vital clue. See, HM surgery had removed a structure called the hippocampus. And that's how scientists realized it was absolutely vital for turning new experiences into long-term memories. But it's not the storage cabinet itself. A better way to think of it is like a librarian or a file manager. It decides where to store the memories, which are then distributed all across the different parts of the brain's cortex. And it turns out the brain uses different systems for different kinds of memories. On the one hand, you have what's called procedural memory. That's knowing how to do things, like ride a bike or play an instrument. That uses a region called the basal ganglia. On the other hand, there's declarative memory, knowing what things are, like facts and events. And that relies on the hippocampus and its neighborhood, the region we were just talking about. And understanding these memory systems is so critical because when they fail, the consequences are just devastating. This chart just shows the annual cost of a few of these disorders. Alzheimer's disease alone costs $100 billion a year. The numbers are staggering, and they really underscore why every single discovery in neuroscience matters so much. We've journeyed from a single neuron all the way up to the vast networks that create our perceptions and our memories. But we have truly only scratched the surface. The brain remains the greatest frontier in science. And with 1 trillion neurons firing away inside our heads, the deepest question of all still remains. What fundamental mysteries of thought, of identity, of consciousness itself are just waiting to be unlocked?